Better Business CD is a joint initiative of media production company Business Essentials and magazine publisher Switzer Communications. Welcome to this January-March 2004 edition of Better Business Magazine CD. I'm Michael Schulberger. When we talk about leadership, we usually think about big business. But that's a nonsense really, because strong, effective leadership is at least as relevant and important in small to medium-sized enterprises. We'll hear from Peter Switzer on that subject in a moment. And you're also likely to be fascinated by a real example of leadership and achievement presented by Serena Russo. As a teenager, she went to work as a typist, but she didn't like it and decided instead to start a typing school for 10 students. She obviously had motivational and leadership skills. Serena Russo now runs a business employing 500 people and turning over tens of millions of dollars. She's just written a book, Meet Me at the Top, in which she describes the highs and lows she's encountered in getting where she is today. Over the years, she studied management and leadership and applied the skills to her small business, which has, of course, become somewhat larger now. You can read about Serena in our Better Business magazine, and I'll be talking to her on this CD shortly. First, the importance and relevance of sound leadership in small to medium enterprises. So many of us think leadership is for big business. We're so busy growing our own small businesses that we don't think of ourselves as leaders too. But we are. Peter Switzer. You say leadership in small business is just as important, maybe more important than for big business, and the starting point comes as we begin to grow.
I think it becomes really clear once you start employing people. I think when you start your own home-based business and maybe you're by yourself or husband and wife or partners or whatever, it's a little bit easier. You often take the roles based on your relative strengths. But once you start employing people, you start realising that you do have a new role, and we're often not trained in that role of leadership. We're good at achieving, spectacular results with our work and delivering on time and all that sort of stuff, but all of a sudden someone's looking to you for guidance, for job allocations, for ways to do things. Ultimately, I guess that's why Michael Gerber talks about the importance of putting systems in place so that when you bring new people on, they instantly can be shown what's expected, like how is a phone answered, how do you talk to customers, how do you follow up, how do you record things. All those sort of things are really important, and I think a leader has to understand the importance of it and start imparting the right messages from the very, very moment you start employing people.
But then, of course, that leader might have been very good at coming up with the idea to develop a product or develop a service, but that doesn't mean he or she is any good at administering, managing people.
That's right, and that's another advantage I think big businesses have, because sometimes I think big businesses make mistakes in appointing the wrong people, but it doesn't take long before the objective or even the subjective analysis of the performance of the management or the manager comes under question, and then they start looking for changes. When you're running your own business, and if you're not particularly good at leadership, it might be very difficult for you to make a hard call judgment on yourself. And I've noticed in the very successful small business and medium-sized businesses, the roles of coaches or mentors are becoming increasingly more important in these people's progress in running their businesses. They're looking for external advisors, external observers of what they do, looking for recommendations that can improve their performance. And I think the small business person has to make this objective call. Do I need help to drive this business into the fast lane? And then remember, and I know you've done stories on this and so have I, the SWOT analysis for a long time has been one of the best things you could do with your business, looking at your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities and threats. But I think increasingly, particularly with the growth of business coaches, I'm starting to realise that the individual who runs a business really should be doing a SWOT analysis on themselves. What are my strengths, my weaknesses, my opportunities, and what are my threats to my own business success? And I think that's where the objective observer, the business coach, the mentor can often come in. And if you're lucky and you're not good at leadership, one of these advisors might say, well, why don't you appoint a manager to take on all those roles, and then you sit down and keep doing what you're good at, thinking about inspiring your employees, working well with your customers. That might be your strength, but you might not be good at actually running an operation. And I think that's the benefit of business coaches, life coaches, and all those sorts of things, is this objective observation, this SWOT analysis. And I think the interesting thing is, I'm also arguing with people, you should concentrate on what I call the F word, not the business plan or the B plan, but the F word. Focus on yourself and make yourself as strong and as competitive as you possibly can be. And sometimes that means changing your role.
And that goes on because then you've got to start thinking about who's going to help you plan succession.
Oh, without a doubt. And I've always said to people in businesses, let's ask the question, what is the most important asset that you've got? And then ultimately and generally, the most important asset is you. You've inspired the business, you've generated it, you think about it night and day. And sometimes you don't look after yourself, you might get injured, you might get sick. And have you got a plan that will make sure your business keeps on going whether you're there or not? Everyone should do that. Gerber says you should turn your business into a turnkey operation, so you actually could step out and sell it. And I think many of us forget that kind of thing. By putting in really good systems, by showing the leadership to create a turnkey operation that makes your business sellable to anyone. And then ultimately, Michael, that's the focal point of franchising, that you get a business that's proven itself to be a good business, and then they systemise it well enough that they can sell it to anyone, and it still operates very, very effectively.
Well, only just recently, I believe, Peter, that you've learnt how to pass certain jobs on within your own enterprise.
Well, that's right. And this is another important thing. I know Jack Welch talks about empowering your staff, encouraging them, celebrating victories and things like that. And I've got to say, only yesterday I was just overloaded with some requests from the Australian newspaper for my small business page on Tuesdays. And my assistant, Jess Blanche, who's been writing stories generally picked to suit her style and her interest, but because I was just completely overridden with work, I just said, Jess, you're going to have to do a story on the economy. Now, she did it very well. I actually had to wince with pain when I saw she had the prominent story on my own page in the paper. But the take-home message for me was that in being selfless and in encouraging my staff member to develop, I've now effectively made my business a much better business. I've got a much better system in place now. I could be sick one day and Jess could effectively write the key stories to make the page work. So in many ways, I learnt a lesson myself under the pressure of having too much work. And the end result was, I learnt something about developing my staff. And that's another thing that Jack Welch says. If you really want to develop your business, develop your staff. You don't only build loyalty, but you also create a staff that's really worth keeping. And I know you know the Tom O'Toole line where Tom said that someone said to him once, but Tom, if you train your staff as you advise and they leave you, well, it's really going to cost you. And Tom says, well, imagine if you don't train them and they stay. And that's the important point. I think you really got to train up your staff. That's an important sign of a leader. The end result is you haven't not only got better staff, you've got a much better business.
Peter Switzer, thank you. When we talk about leadership, it's true, isn't it, that some people seem to have innate qualities that drive them to the top, and they encourage all around them to be leaders too. This came to mind when I heard about a lady named Serena Russo. Her family was Italian, and from the age of 10 she effectively ran her father's vineyard because he couldn't speak English. When she left school she became a typist, but that was never going to be enough. She was sacked many times, largely because she felt she wasn't being challenged enough. Why am I telling you about Serena Russo? Because she now employs nearly 500 people around Australia and her business turns over tens of millions of dollars. She heads the Russo Institute of Technology in the heart of Brisbane. She started in business with a typing school for 10 students, guaranteeing them all she would get them jobs. Her business still teaches typing, and she's found jobs for thousands of students now working in partnership with the government. Serena recently paid more than $100,000 to sponsor a Bill Clinton dinner, and she was given the honour of being introduced alongside the former US president and sitting next to him at dinner. Her passion, her persistence, and her belief in herself have helped her reach amazing heights. One of her biggest challenges was to leave the family home at an age she thought was fair to her father, who really had a dominating influence over her. She had decided she needed to do her thing and not what father wanted.
When I hit 26, I realised that I didn't want to do it anymore. So I was going through enormous family challenge, where my father wanted to see me married and I wanted to see myself being financially independent. So I left home, which was like a death in the family. And I decided then, after 12 months of doing that, that I wanted to start my own business because I couldn't hold down a legal job. I was a typing teacher at night, and they fired me there as well. And I really recognised I was good at that was when I had to be reinstated because all my students were going to walk out on me. So that was the first time I recognised that I was really good at something. And then I started a little typing school with something like 10 students, and today we have a multi-million-dollar business in education, training and recruiting.
That's amazing, with about 500 employees.
That's exactly right. So you can work out what that payroll is on a fortnightly basis.
When you first started that typing school, all the advice you were given was against it.
Oh, yeah, that's right. My bosses thought I was crazy. My brother, who built my desks, said, I've gone off the deep end. My father said, go back and be a legal secretary. There's only about maybe one person who really believed in me, and today he still believes in me, and his name is Jerry Panisi, who married my sister. And that was the greatest thing she ever did, was marry Jerry Panisi, because now he's my co-director and he's been coaching me right for the last 24 years. In fact, we celebrate 24 years of business this month.
Now, you've always believed in yourself, haven't you?
Always, even as a child. I always remember my games. I used to have this desire to be a teacher, and I used to play underneath the house with a blackboard and a piece of chalk, and I was talking to all these invisible students, and I would do that for hours and hours and hours. And today I am a communicator, and I really started off as a communicator in teaching. And I must have loved it as a child, and I still love it today, and I'm very, very passionate about it. In fact, when you think about it, in our Contract 3 with Job Network, I'm the largest private commercial job network in Australia. We would be serving anything up to 50,000 job seekers through our contract, and I think it's an honour to serve and help job seekers with their lives. So I've been there without any money, and I've been there without a dream. But I think one of the greatest things in life is enhancing someone's life, because as you're enhancing it, you're also enhancing your own. And I think I've been blessed through my team, through my management team, to help job seekers throughout Australia. It's very touching to talk about it.
You say it's not so much what happens to you that matters, it's what you do about it that's important.
Absolutely. I mean, today I'm always faced with challenges, and they never end. However, it's not what happens to you, it's what you do about it. I mean, the bank manager says no to you that you want to buy a house. You don't stop. You just work out, well, maybe I've got to go out and get 2 jobs or a part-time job, or, how badly do you want it? And there's always a creative way of making things happen. And I think that's what's happened to me, is that I never ever stop being a lateral thinker. I'm always thinking out of the square box. And I encourage any of our listeners today to think of how passionate are you, and not accepting a no, but working out a way of what it is you really, really want, and just go for it and be single-minded. And I also say become intelligently selfish, because if you can work hard on yourself, then what you can do at anything, you will be able to help others as well through your journey.
In fact, as you say in your book, never let fear cloud your judgment.
Actually, Rudy Giuliani said it well when he talks about his 7 steps for leadership, to be a great leader. One of the things that he says is about having courage. And courage is being able to execute with already having that fear as you execute. So having the courage and feeling the fear and still being able to proceed. That's what courage is. And I believe that every leader has the courage to go out there and execute and take massive action on a great idea.
Be the person you want to be, not the person someone else wants you to be.
That's right. I mean, it's great to have mentors. I mean, one of the greatest mentors I've had the privilege to meet is Bill Clinton. I remember when I had that opportunity to be a bit of a philanthropist, as well as support our city of Brisbane, because nobody wanted to sponsor that dinner. To me, to be able to meet someone who I really, really admired as the president for 10 years was just a great honour. And I still believe he'll be one of the greatest presidents in my lifetime.
Now, you paid $110,000 for that dinner.
Well, I'm not allowed to say that. That's what the offer was, but we had to negotiate a confidentiality deal. But it was certainly a very, very high amount.
And it was worth it?
Absolutely. I would never have changed that decision. What it did for the city of Brisbane, I mean, it was like a backdrop of a stage. We had President Bill Clinton in Brisbane, we had the Queen, and we had Tony Blair. I mean, how good is that? And I was able to introduce Bill Clinton that night, and to me that was the biggest milestone of my life. Remember, I was a migrant kid who could hardly speak English, and my family went through a lot of struggles as migrants, and there I was several years later introducing the President of the United States of America.
Just a couple of quick bits of advice that you give in the book. Always have a bank of cash prepared for an uncertainty.
I'm a great believer in paying your debt. There are great entrepreneurs who go out there and have the courage to borrow big, but that's not me. I like to borrow, but I like to pay back. In fact, I like the bankers when they say, we didn't expect you to pay it back so soon. I think it's very, very important to pay back your debt and do it in small steps and then go to the larger step. But certainly taking risks, but don't be too sort of outrageous. Be a little conservative, because in life you never know what's around the corner. It's always good to have cash in the bank.
But you've also taken risks for things you didn't really have to have, like a smart Mercedes that you could look at yourself in the window as you went past?
Oh, yeah, okay. That was only because I wanted to show my boyfriend that I too could have a Mercedes. They say the best form of revenge is massive success. You know, when the guys say it's all over and you think it's still the beginning, you know, it's really hard to take. But yeah, I did have that Mercedes. Today my nephew drives it, but I enjoy Porsches today.
Right. Now, you've established an empire. Where to from here?
I think, Michael, it's to be able to still touch people's lives. I mean, somehow, for some reason, I've chosen a journey where I'm all about helping students internationally or domestic students. I'm here to help the job seekers, and also I'm here to work as a partner with employers. And I think nothing is greater to be able to be given the opportunity that we've already have had with the council, the local government, the state government, the federal government, and also employers, major and minor, to go out there and become their backroom partners, to understand the bottom line and to have a one-stop shop where we do their training as well as we do their recruitment, and we service the corporate's needs, which is really an incredible joy. And in the meantime, we're also helping our job seekers go out there and step up in their lives.
Serena Russo, meet me at the top. I probably wouldn't be sitting in the studio if it hadn't been for a man called Nigel Dick. You see, Nigel has powers of persuasion which affected my career and which has brought him huge success in his own field of selling. Nigel Dick coaxed me to switch from newspapers to television way back in the 50s when he was sales manager at Channel 9 in Melbourne. I made the move to the new medium, against all good advice, and was working in the Channel 9 newsroom producing news and writing scripts when Nigel wandered in one day and persuaded me to do on-air reporting. The rest is history. He went on to be chief executive at Channel 9, then Channel 7, and he's been a giant of the media business for almost 50 years. These days, he's the billion-dollar man. He sold much more than $1 billion in advertising, and he's a keynote celebrity speaker, telling everyone he's still a salesman. Nigel Dick, what makes a good salesperson?
Having a lot of confidence in yourself, but I think importantly, knowing and understanding the product or service that you're selling. You've got to be a student of the product or the service. You've also got to be a student of the area in which your product or service is working. You've got to know all about your opposition, and you've got to know how your product or service will help the consumer or the person to whom you are selling.
But you still have to have the ability to be able to communicate and to sell. Are you born a salesperson?
No, you're not born a salesman. You learn the rudiments of selling, and I think probably the simplest little homily is learn to tell people that you can help them, show them how, and prove it, and you've made a sale. But importantly, if you don't know your product intimately, then you won't sell it. Also importantly, you must go and determine from your prospect what it is he wants or she wants your product to do for their product. Now, I believe in double flip selling. I think it's very important to go along and see a prospective client, and everybody will talk to you about their business, or most people will, and say to them, hey, I believe that what I have to sell will help you and help improve your profits. Now, they'll sit down and tell you then about their business. That enables you to go back and have a good think about it and come back with a proposal that really interfaces much better to what they're about than you would otherwise have been able to do.
There are some people who don't even like to identify themselves as salespeople.
Well, I learnt that lesson in 1960, and there were three parts to learning to be a salesman. All happened at the one time. There was a person, that was Perry Como. There was a product, that was Kraft. And there was an advertising agency, J. Walter Thompson. I was in New York for the first time, and I was invited to a cocktail party where the first Perry Como show, sponsored by Kraft, with J. Walter Thompson as the advertising agency, was going to air. And afterwards we were having drinks and snacks, and I was talking to a group of people, including a 6'2", 6'3", sartorially dressed American executive. Looked like about 42, 43, seemed quite old to me then because I was about 30. And he was about 6'2", 6'3", looked like an American ex-collegiate basketball player. And he asked me what I did, and I told him, and he asked about Australia and asked about television. And I said to him after he had finished cross-examining me, I said, "What do you do?" And he seemed to draw himself up another inch or two. And he said, "I'm a salesman," and he walked off. And I said to the group, with whom I was talking, "What does he do?" And they said, "He's the president of Kraft." Now, that made me suddenly realise that we play around with words in this country. And they do in the UK as well. We call people account executives, merchandisers, sales executives, advertising executives. But we never turn around and say, hey, proudly, as we should, hey, I'm a salesman. Because the world won't work without selling. It's vital that we sell goods and services domestically and overseas. Otherwise, the economy grinds to a halt. Therefore, I believe we should be proud to be salespeople standing 10 feet tall.
And you've sold about $1 billion worth of...
Well, actually more than $1 billion. That was a catchphrase that a mate of mine tagged onto a brochure that has been published selling my services. He asked me in an idle moment, "How much advertising time have you sold?" I went back and I thought about it, and directly and indirectly, I mean directly and indirectly in the sense that I was the sales manager or the general manager or the managing director or chairman of a company, and therefore one can say those sales are indirectly your responsibility. And actually I've sold about $1.75 billion worth in today's dollar terms, and that's just television advertising. That puts aside the television programs I sold overseas for Crawford's, it puts aside the radio time I've sold, the magazine time I've sold, and the responsibility I had for all the sales of the Broadcasting Corporation of New Zealand for 3 years.
Probably a $2 billion man.
I'm probably a $2 billion man, yes.
Of all of that, just briefly, does something stick out in your mind as to one of your perhaps better success stories?
Well, yes, I've always said that advertising is an educational technique, or selling is an educational technique that requires a lot of repetition to achieve its end. Perhaps this is taking it to the nth degree, but I remember years ago I was in Sydney and I was trying to sell the cricket to Ted Harris, who was then the advertising manager of Ampol. Mm-hmm. And Ted was always interested in sport, but he didn't really want to spend the money, and he was sort of half-hearted about it and said, "I'll let you know tomorrow." So I came back to Melbourne, and the next day I sent him, in those days we had telexes, not emails as we do today, and I sent him a telex on the hour, every hour, telling him of the advantages of buying the cricket. And after about 6 telexes, he sent me one back saying, "You win." So that was a great success. Yes. But I've had failures as well, and I think probably the failures lie when I haven't thought out how I might put people offside. In selling advertising, you're really selling two people. You're selling the advertising agency, and you're selling the client, who's the ultimate person who pays the bill. And I remember on one occasion, a couple of occasions actually, but one in particular, it was to do with Carnation Milk. I went straight to Carnation Milk because I was cheesed off with the agency, advertising agency at that time, and I got the agency offside, and the agency was better than I was, so I failed.
And they won. You talk about failure as well as success. Many people fear failure or rejection.
Yes, they do. And I think that we have to understand that rejection is part of selling because we're not going to succeed on every occasion. And importantly, we have to learn from those rejections and understand from them whether it was our fault or whether it was just simply a case of our proposition not being one that would have been of real benefit to the client.
Well, finally, your best sales job ever must have been back at the end of 1957 when you persuaded this poor, inexperienced cadet journalist from the Herald Sun to join Channel 9 for £1 a week more than he was getting, from £12 a week to £13 a week.
I might say to you, Michael Schulberger, that £12 to £13 in those days was, or even today, that's a little under 10%. I think that's not a bad...
You could sell anything to anyone, couldn't you?
I think that's pretty good. But let's face it, what happened about 3 or 4 months later?
Yes, indeed. You were kind enough to give me an increase of another £4 a week.
Which was 33 1/3%.
Nigel Dick, the $1 billion man. Loving your company and its products isn't enough if your customers don't feel the same way. That rule's so important in sales, and it extends to every marketing initiative you try. Anita Zima of the Marketing Bank says the key to getting it right is research. Research that tells you all about your customers and what they want.
Our company's recently done a major marketing strategy for a well-known premium jewellery company. And within that premium jewellery category, there would probably be 12 competitors, and each of those offers much of a muchness in terms of the offering, whether it's estate jewellery or whether it's modern jewellery, the premium end of the business. But what is it about the customer experience at the point of buying that jewellery? So as a customer, do you buy it for your wife on an anniversary or a special occasion? Do you buy it as a gift for staff? Do you buy it as a treat for yourself? Do you buy it as corporate gifts? Do you like to have it handmade? What is it about it? And when you're making that purchase, what's the experience? Is it a special occasion where you want to surprise the recipient of it? Do you want it tomorrow? Are you happy to wait for 8 weeks to have it made up? Really understanding that customer base helps you then define what you're offering.
So I can hear listeners to you now saying, that's all very well, that's terrific, and we know you're perfectly right, but there's a huge cost involved in doing that.
That's not entirely true. All the big brands that you would be familiar with do ongoing research, and they live and die by the numbers. Research is actually surprisingly low cost, and you can get onto an omnibus, for example. You can have 5 questions about your product put onto a standard questionnaire that goes to the community every fortnight, and all of a sudden you can find out some very interesting results about whether people even know of your brand or what they think is associated with your brand, the attributes. Or you can run some focus groups and think tanks, maybe with 2 lots of 10 people, and find out all sorts of things that will really surprise you.
You tend to think that research is for big companies. That's not right.
No, it can be for smart startups, and we've worked with many of those over the last 7 years while we've been in business, and the smart startups are on the path to success because they've had the idea, they test it, they refine it, and then they take it to market.
Do you find when you go to an organisation or they come to you and with a particular project that it's difficult to persuade them to do the sort of things you ask of them early in the piece? Because presumably they come to you and say, look, here's my product, go flog it.
I guess we've learnt the hard way as well. We no longer work with clients who don't value a professional marketing approach. It's important to know what you don't know. I mean, we go to good advisors on all sorts of other issues. If you are going to a strategic marketing consultancy, then it's important to understand that there's a whole skill set there that's worth listening to. We have a process like, I suppose, most of our own competitors would have, a process that guides customers through a number of steps that helps them reach the conclusions they need to come to before they take a product or service to market. Although a lot of our customers are established brands, there's still a great workshop that we do that is all about brand visioning, and out of that we know then all the information that's available and also the gaps of what's not there. And in that case, it's not us telling that company, well, you need to know this and this and this. They then realise themselves, gosh, I don't even know the answer to that. I need to do some research, or I better find out, or I need to be better informed before I take the next step. So it's not us telling you. It comes to light pretty easily on its own.
You've talked of bringing new products to market, but often a long-standing product mightn't be doing all that well because of changes in the environment, changes in the way people think.
And that's faced all the time, and it's sometimes where an industry dies because they weren't quick enough to understand that the environment had changed. And an example at the moment that's out there in the media a lot is the Coke story, where as Coke had believed that it was invincible and the fizzy drink would be king forever, there's been an environmental shift where the consumers are saying, no, I actually am looking at health and wellness, and soft drinks don't fit into my needs anymore. and they are going down a functional food line, which is what we call health through food. And so Coke has picked that up very quickly, and as you would probably have read, is buying up water companies and juice companies. And the Coke brand is actually adapting to a changing environment. And if it didn't, it would die.
What size should a company be before they have their own marketing person?
Some people start up an organisation knowing that marketing is the only thing that's ever going to differentiate them from their competitors, and that they will say that their marketers first and foremost. And I can think of a small winery that has very, very successfully grown on that premise. They know that they're good winemakers, but so is every other winemaker. They've said, we're actually a marketing company. And it's from that platform that they've built their brand. Because ultimately, it's probably 5% of the population that's the wine connoisseur. Most of us know what we like and like what we drink. But they've made that decision that they're marketers. But going back to that question about how big do you have to be to have a marketing person, I would probably argue it's a pretty fundamental step, that if you don't have a dedicated marketer in a startup, you need some close advice in a seamless relationship that will be there to guide you along the way and to keep you on track.
We talk marketing, direct advertising as well.
The marketing plan guides you. It becomes the blueprint or the template for the activity that will meet your objectives. And whilst we do manage the research and the strategic planning, we also drive the implementation of that. And so you then have to outsource and make sure the activities get done, because we always say there's nothing worse than a strategy that sits on a shelf collecting dust. That's of no value. And nor is it of any value if you just go out and do activities because it was a good idea or because the boss likes it. That's not a good enough reason either. So it's the marriage of the thinking and the doing, and those two together will deliver the results.
Anita Zima, the Marketing Bank. Erica King isn't a dentist, but her company, Focus Dental Management, has advised more than 350 dental practices around Australia, increasing turnover by $200,000 in the first year. She says her techniques apply across the entire business spectrum, starting with the people in the business. And as Erica King tells Heather Dawson, it's not a question of the right people for the business.
I'd like to turn that around and say, well, let's look at how the business can be a better fit for the staff. So looking at their strengths, looking at their weaknesses, aligning the leaders' communication style, strategies with the staff, because a lot of staff have a lot of potential but are never really allowed to develop that.
What happens when you find a staff member that perhaps isn't the right fit for the business?
Well, I think you give them a chance. You give them an opportunity, you work with them, and really they come to that decision themselves eventually, if that's the case.
So for the 350 dental practices that you work for, do you reckon really that you have always been able to turn around staff members that maybe aren't so happy or aren't achieving the best?
In about 90% of the cases, and I've worked with thousands of staff over the years, is once they're given some direction, they're giving some guidelines, some structure, some opportunity, 90% of them turn around. It's fantastic.
Now you say conflict is one of the major problems between staff members. What have you found?
Conflict is really always about communication. So people not understanding the differences between how one communicates and the other. And that's really where most conflict arises, not really understanding each other properly.
Of course, busy business operators don't always notice whether it's happening or not amongst the staff people that work for them. Is that a problem?
No, they're just oblivious to that sort of thing until it becomes a volcanic explosion. So I would rather deal with the lumpy bits of carpet in the corner than wait for the volcano to explode. And if people are dealing with issues as they arise in a manner which is like working with the personal issues versus the professional issues, it's much easier and those issues become nothing.
So is it a question of sitting down and dealing with each member of staff on an individual basis to try to get to the bottom of a problem?
It could be that, but it could be also ensuring that there's a protocol in place of like what happens when I'm needing to discuss something or an issue's not quite working out the way I'd hoped or whatever. So it's having some protocols, having some channels of communication and, having that opportunity with someone who will listen and work it through with them.
Well, for the boss of the business or for the dental practice in your case, what about their objectives, being quite clear about their objectives? Is that sometimes a problem that they know what they want but they don't know how to get there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think they know what they like the end result to be, but in actually coming from where they are today to where they want to go, they have no actual business skills or people skills or structure or ability to even monitor it on a day-to-day basis because they're so busy doing what they are trained to do professionally that they don't ever get to the actual business.
So what do you do for the practices that you turn around so remarkably well?
Really put in structure, systems, clearly define the goals, ensure that the dentist's goals or the business owner's goals are aligned with the staff's goals, and ensure that everybody has ownership of what's happening, that they're involved in the whole process of change. That's the most important thing.
And communication is key.
Absolutely critical. And that everybody feels that they can communicate when things are working well, when they're not working well, and everything else in between.
But that communication extends to customers too?
Certainly in our business, if the teams are not communicating with their customers, then they're not returning, they're not accepting treatment, they're not following through, they're not retaining their client base. So communication with their clients is absolutely critical, and that's increased enormously.
Now, you sort out the people side of the business, but then, of course, that's only part of the equation. There's the financial management to get a handle on as well. What do you do?
Really rationalise where expenditure. Certainly a huge area of loss of control is in ordering of materials and supplies. So there's a huge cost saving that can be achieved there, and really making people more efficient with their time. So the business owner, the staff, so that there is, time is money, and making an hourly rate and across the board and looking at how people work efficiently.
Are the business owners that you deal with sometimes surprised by the things that you pick up as an outsider perhaps coming into the business?
Absolutely. Would never have seen it. Just could never have believed that they could not only save money, make more money, be able to enjoy what they're doing more. They can't believe it. So that's why we have long-term clients, which is great.
The final link, of course, is marketing. So what do you suggest as really good marketing strategies that have worked for the people you work with?
Well, certainly in our client base, internal marketing is absolutely what works all the time. People are concentrating so much on trying to get new business and forgetting about what they've actually got right there under their nose and overlooking that. So internal marketing strategies are really critical to the success of our clients.
How quickly can a business achieve change if they really knuckle down and start doing all the sorts of things that you...
Within about 3 months. They'll really start to see some significant change in the way their day runs, their financial outcomes, the attitude and communication of their staff. Very quickly things start to happen.
Erica King, Focus Dental Management. Watch out, you have a 1 in 10 chance that a tax auditor will come knocking on your door anytime soon. But tax policy and education consultant Angela McRae, formerly known as Angela Ryan, says don't panic. She's told Jill Aiken that just because you're chosen for an audit, you're not automatically presumed guilty. So her advice is to keep cool and prepare. First, what is the tax office clamping down on?
The main issues for small and medium businesses are fraudulent or incorrect claims for GST, in particular big GST refunds. If you're putting in a big refund claim, you're likely to see the auditor at your door. Businesses not understanding their obligations is still a big issue that they're finding, with GST in particular, and also GST on sale of assets and for government grants, treatment of government grants. So they'll be the focus on the GST side. For the income tax side, it's still very much focusing on record keeping and whether people have got the documentation to support the claims that they're making.
So are they also still targeting things like the cash economy and tax evasion?
In fact, the tax office can much more effectively target the cash economy these days. One of the beauties for the tax office is in having all that detailed information we now put on our business activity statements is that they can do a lot more matching between income tax returns and those business activity statements. And that matching allows them to bring out a lot more of the cash economy than they were previously able to do. The tax evasion hotline is also another area that they get information from, and they actually had 40,000 calls to that line last year and were able to raise an additional $44 million in tax revenue. So you've got to look out, if you're a business person and you're doing dealings, that you're doing things the right way, because there's an easy way now to be dobbed in, if you like. So don't think that just because you think the tax man doesn't know about you, because you're hidden, that he's not going to hear from someone else about you.
What about superannuation and payments to employees? Is there a watch out there for employers?
There are some new arrangements coming in from the start of this financial year to make superannuation guarantee payments quarterly. So the tax office will be putting a lot of resources there. On that particular issue, they're likely to be looking at education as much as auditing for the first couple of quarters. But the Commissioner has just announced that about 1 in 5 self-managed super funds will be subject to audit this year. So that's a pretty high target rate. So again, I think if you've got your own super fund, you need to be expecting that you may well see the auditor at your door.
What about aggressive tax planning arrangements? Does that make you a more likely target?
Certainly, I think a lot of taxpayers would be aware that the mass-marketed tax schemes were a really big focus for the Tax Office for the last few years, and they've been now told to look at these issues in much more detail and try and get on top of them more quickly. The Tax Office is putting out new statements called taxpayer alerts, and I would suggest that you really should heed the Commissioner's advice that if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. So be careful, because they're the sorts of things the Tax Office is looking at much more closely these days.
Well, if the tax office does call you and say that they're going to audit you, what's the first thing you should do? Because I imagine most of us would panic.
And I'm sure that is the response from just about everybody. Open that mail, you see tax office in the window and you think, oh no, I hope this isn't going to be a call for an audit. But once you've got over that initial panic, I think it's very important that you get prepared and be well organised for an audit. You're usually given notice ahead of any audit, and you will be advised on the sorts of information and records that the Tax Office require. So get all of that information well organised ahead of the auditors actually coming around, making sure that you've checked through all the details, and if there are any problems, very often the best advice is to come clean before the interview starts, and in that way you can avoid extra penalties.
And seek professional advice. Get your accountant or other advisors to be with you?
I think that really depends on the complexity of the issue. Some audits, and in fact, although we think of audits as an auditor coming and doing a full desk audit, often now the Tax Office has a range of compliance activities, and an audit might be as simple as a phone call and you don't need professional advice. But certainly I think as soon as you're feeling you're out of your depth or you're being asked questions that you don't understand, definitely seek professional advice.
And does that go as far as actually having that person with you when you're interviewed?
You're actually able to have someone with you at any stage. So even if you decided you would go into the audit, you wouldn't have a professional with you, and then you feel like this is running away from me, I do need some help, you do have rights at that stage to say that you do want to have a professional with you. You can actually have someone act on your behalf in many situations, but there are some cases where you must answer questions on your own behalf. But in most cases you are able to actually have somebody act for you if you would prefer that.
How far can the auditors go? Can they actually take your records or documents away and contact your bank, those sorts of things?
The Tax Office does actually have very wide-ranging powers, and they have been tested quite extensively in the courts, but they are allowed to take copies of records. They can contact third parties, and there's only a very limited range of things that they can't do, limited by legal privilege and what have you. But basically the Tax Office does have very wide-ranging powers.
What are your rights if you're not so happy about the way that they're approaching the audit? Do you have any form of redress?
There are review rights, and they cover a whole range of potential methods, and it's difficult to say. In any situation, it will depend on how serious your unhappiness with the conduct of the audit has been, but you can contact the Ombudsman. The Taxpayers Charter sets out the roles and responsibilities for auditors and auditees, so you can look to that. If you're unhappy with the outcome of the audit, you can actually take legal proceedings through the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and in cases where the law is not settled, it's even possible that the Tax Office itself may fund a test case and fund a review of your situation. So all of those things would need to be considered in the situation, but certainly if you're not happy with the outcome, do seek some assistance. The Tax Office themselves will let you know what your review rights are, but it's another case where you might need professional help as well.
In summary then, is there any overriding message to business operators when preparing for the dreaded audit?
I think be prepared, absolutely essential. Try and keep cool. It's hard when you feel like you're in a crisis and under pressure, but certainly just because you've been chosen for an audit, you're not automatically assumed to be guilty. So keep cool, be open and as honest as you can, because that's your best way really to minimise the penalties, and do seek professional assistance if you need to.
Angela McRae. It's inevitable, really. Put a bunch of people together in a working environment, and before you know it, personal relationships develop. That's great for the couples concerned as the affair blossoms and grows. Not great for business, though, when things fall apart, or when personal feelings get in the way of astute decision-making. According to Kate Jenkins, partner with legal firm Freehills, personal liaisons at work present many business issues, some with legal implications. She explains her point to Heather Dawson.
There's a whole range of ways that issues come up. They include sexual harassment claims when the relationship goes sour, even stalking claims and applications for restraining orders, resignations or unfair dismissal claims if someone loses their job, work cover claims if someone feels that they're so distressed at work as a result of the relationship going badly. Performance issues can arise where people's performance is impaired, whether they're in love or not in love. There can be conflict of interest issues where someone more senior is making decisions about the pay, for example, of a junior person with whom they're in a relationship, or giving confidential information to someone that they shouldn't be providing information to. There's issues about relationships with competitors, with someone from a competitor. And then more recently, I've even been in a situation where there's sort of been a blackmailing issue where one of the co-workers was in a relationship and was also married, and another one of the workers said, well, if you don't do this, I will tell your husband you're having this relationship. So the issues are quite diverse.
Well, can you give us some examples, Kate, of what you've seen?
I had a recent case where a woman who had been employed on a probationary period had her employment ended, and she has brought a claim against the company saying that I was being treated in a disadvantaged way at work. On further investigations, it turns out that her boss had been dating a good friend of hers, and through that relationship she had been given a whole lot of information about discussions that had been happening at a higher level about her employment, which she then used to say I was being bullied and harassed during the workplace. Now, whilst those discussions may not have been appropriate, she should never have been aware of any of those things going on, and it was only because of this concealed relationship that she became aware of them. Another example, which is quite common, is a senior person who's had a relationship at work with one of the more junior staff members. The more junior staff member thought he was separated because he was working in another state to where his wife and family lived, and ultimately she learnt that he was proposing to go back to his wife. Following that, there was a number of months of emotional turmoil between the two of them, where she said that just seeing him at work caused her an occupational health and safety risk, that it was an unsafe working environment. And so she brought a sexual harassment complaint, and the issue was whether that was sexual harassment or simply just the remnants of star-crossed lovers who had a bad relationship.
It sounds like it's the women in the work environment that are often more vulnerable in these cases.
It is true that in my experience, lots of the cases involve obviously men and women in many cases, but the women are in the more junior roles, and that probably matches the statistics of the workforce. And so it is the person who's more junior who feels vulnerable, particularly when it goes wrong. Having said that, maybe that person also gets some advantages when it's going very well, so it could work the other way.
And do they often land up in court, these problems?
They often end up in legal issues, less so in court, although they do come up in sexual harassment cases and unfair dismissal cases, and sometimes where confidential information's been stolen.
Well, the question is, I guess, what to do about these issues. Is there any emerging trend, either here or overseas, on how businesses should handle office liaisons?
Here, the approach has been to, rather than banning relationships, to addressing them. And the best organisations are putting in place conflict of interest policies to try and get full disclosure about relationships that are in place, and also making sure their sexual harassment policies are clear and that people know when something is unacceptable and when it's acceptable.
The bottom line, though, is that if you're having an affair with somebody in the office, you should let your manager know or your boss know.
If it affects the business, yes. So it's not that you should let them know as a matter of gossip, but it will have genuine impacts on the business, so that, yes, it is appropriate. And organisations need to encourage and create an environment where it'll be clear that that won't cause sort of a disadvantage at work. But yes, you should be informing people.
Now, in the United States, I believe some companies have even introduced what's called love contracts, where employees promise not to sue their employers for sexual harassment or discrimination if the workplace relationship ends. Is that going a bit far, or what's your view?
My view is in Australia they wouldn't be enforceable. You can't sign up to say, look, I won't be sexually harassed sometime in the future. And it's very common, for example, that where a relationship ends, that one party will continue to pursue it, and at that point it might come sexual harassment. But the point of those contracts is to create, again, disclosure about the relationship so it can be addressed. And to that extent, I think that's how Australia is going.
Okay, so what do you think is the best policy? How should companies approach the question of personal relationships at work?
I think companies should have a written policy that makes clear that people should disclose personal relationships that might impact at work, that they encourage people to disclose in an active way, and then have safeguards that they can put in place where a relationship is in place. For example, if a senior person is in a relationship with someone who reports to them, that you put in place safeguards to ensure they are not the sole decision maker about their pay or their appraisal, because they would have difficulty giving that view with an unbiased approach. And also, and even though employers hate doing this, I think employers and managers should be proactive if they identify an issue at work or a relationship, that they discuss it on an appropriate level, not as a gossip thing, but if they identify that there might be a relationship that could impact work, to actually discuss it.
Could you turn the tables, though, and argue that managers or business operators actually don't have the right to know about what's going on between employees? And, that could even be seen as overstepping the privacy of those employees, couldn't it?
Yes. To the extent that it impacts on the business, the privacy laws wouldn't prevent learning about that relationship. So it is looking at this to the extent that it impacts on the business, not what people are doing outside of work hours on their own time.
Kate Jenkins, Freehills. When we talk franchising, we can't really go past Jim. Jim, of course, is Jim Penman, creator of Jim's Mowing, with 2,200 franchisees around the country. These days, Jim has expanded from mowing lawns to more than 20 activities, such as dog washing and computer repairs. He'll even help businesses that want to become franchisors. Jim Penman's franchisees turn over about $120 million a year, and Jim has created a franchising model that many would envy. And how has he achieved success?
One of the reasons that we're successful is because, I suppose in a certain sense, we're not greedy. Like, if a franchisee mows a lawn, charges, let's say, $30, we would get approximately, say, 40 cents of that. And most of that obviously goes in expenses, so I might actually pocket, about 10 cents perhaps. So
the franchisee is making the money?
Yeah, the franchisee makes the money. They only pay royalties about 8 to 10% most divisions. And then the franchisors, who are people who are local, who are looking after them on a very close personal level, they make most of the remaining money. So it's a kind of a trickle-down effect. It works okay because there's so many of them, but it's not a huge revenue stream.
How do you actually appoint the franchisors? How does that come about?
Ideally, franchisors are successful franchisees. We would look for a franchisee who's making good money, somebody who has very good rating in terms of customer service, because we monitor complaints very carefully, and also somebody who's got a history and a habit of helping other people. We have people called trainers who actually are the ones that take new franchisees out on the road, and a lot of trainers give an enormous amount of extra support. For example, the new guy will ring them up and they'll spend an hour and a half in the evening just telling them advice about how to run their business. Not because they're paid, because they're not, just because that's the kind of people they are. And those are the guys that you go to and say, listen, you've got to buy a region. I was talking to a franchisor this morning, one of our real top guys, a guy called Anthony Payton, who's a fencing franchisor, and he's been very successful. Took over a year ago about 7 franchisees, now just reached 20. Which is, not a bad little business, and he's growing really well. He was describing a situation last week where one of his franchisees was getting really discouraged because he had a really, really rotten job digging fence post holes. And he was talking, he said, look, I really want to just walk away. I'm so fed up with this. And Anthony was on the phone. He said, look, I know what you feel. I know what it's like. And he does, because he's a fencer. I know what it's like. But believe me, just keep on, do it, take whatever it is. I know you've underquoted a bit, but keep it on. And it'll come right, believe me. And so he did. And this week he worked, I think, 4 days and made over $3,000 profit. But you need someone like that to give that personal support. And it has to be someone local. And one of the big changes that we've made in the business, and actually part of the turnaround, is I used to run the whole of Melbourne Well, we've split that up. We've now got about 11 local franchisors who give very local personal service. And when we did this, the level of satisfaction rose dramatically. Number of sales, we trebled the number of franchisees in just a few years in certain areas.
But now the number of people that you have involved, going now from franchisees to franchisors, means less return for you.
Well, strangely enough, it doesn't, because it was actually that change that changed the business from making no money to making at least some profits. I'm still not exactly sure how or why, but I think when you're franchising, what we always say, it's a sort of mantra at Jim's, franchisees first. Make your franchisees successful. That's the overwhelming focus, and the rest will work. And it does, actually. We do make more money now by putting franchisors in place, good franchisors, than we used to by trying to do it a lot more directly ourselves.
And talking about pricing, you apparently say that if more than 80% of the quotes are accepted, the price is too low.
The 80% is based on what our average conversion rate is. In a survey we did last year, 1,500 clients, we found that in practice, of those we accept as clients, don't say we can't do them, just under 80% accept the work. They have some work done. So basically what we say is that's pretty reasonable. If you're getting less than 80%, or less than whatever's average for your division, I should say, some of them a little bit lower, then you're probably not giving good enough service. You may be quoting too much, but you're probably, almost certainly 99% of the time, not giving good enough service. On the other hand, if your acceptance rate is higher than that, you're probably quoting too low. I had a franchisee years back who's now a very successful franchisor, but he used to have a real problem with me saying it. In those days, it was 75% because that was normal for mowing. And Anthony said, I used to have a real problem when you said that, Jim, because I was getting my acceptance rates in the 90%. So I really said, okay, I've got to raise all my prices to keep Jim happy. So he did, and he managed to knock it down to the high 80s. And he thought, well, Jim's still not going to be happy. So he put all his prices up again. And he said, no matter how much he tried, he could never get it down to the 75%. But he made an awful lot of money.
Yeah, obviously. But of course, you're in a position to be able to do that because you've got plenty of customers. Otherwise, yes, you couldn't do that.
Yes. But the interesting thing about it is we don't need to compete on price. Take fencing as an example. Now, a 5'4" paling fence is about the most standard object in the universe. It just is a fence. Our competitors will go in and typically quote $34, $35 a metre, which amounts to about, the cost of a fence is about $22 a metre, $22, $23 a metre for material. We quote against them and we're quoting like $39 a metre typically. So substantially more, and yet we win the great majority of our quotes, and our guys are booked out 5 weeks ahead. It's got to do with presentation, it's got to do with reputation, looking after customers really, really well. I mean, my wife hates it when we don't have a division. She says, why can't you get Jim's Plumbing? Because she calls up to have something done to the television or something like that to a Jim's service, and nice answer on the end of the phone. Somebody rings back very shortly. They come out usually the same day. They do it, no fuss, terrific. She loves it. And then the plumber, she has to ring again and again and again, and it drives her mad.
Yes, I'm sure many can relate to that.
But people think they're going to get work by cutting prices. It's the worst, it's the biggest mistake anybody makes in business. Cut prices. Don't cut price, improve service. And then raise your prices because you'll be able to.
Would you recommend franchising to other small business operators?
Well, it depends on the business. Some businesses are better off when they're more like a sales or product business. If you're able to run them direct, it's not a bad idea because you get more of a percentage. But I think for most businesses, it's a great idea. People think we're actually doing everything because we've got like 20 active divisions. But in reality, what normally happens is somebody comes to us and says, I'm interested in franchising, sometimes an idea, usually a business. And, can you help us? So we make it a Jim's division. The actual driving force behind the division is not the Jim's group, it's the individual. Like in fencing, this guy Warren Smith, who came in 2 years ago to his very, very small division and just turned it on its head, and he drove it and he trained people, set up systems, produced materials, better training courses, everything. And it's a brilliant division.
Jim Penman, Jim's Corp. Why do so many of us have trouble achieving balance in our lives? According to Dr. John Lang in his book Re-Life, we can overcome all those things that get in the way of a healthy, balanced, stress-free existence. John Lang has run health management clinics for many years, and he also advises people in business on achieving better, healthier and more successful lives. He tells Heather Dawson it's easy to find that success when we're motivated. The problem for many people is getting motivated, then staying that way.
The problem is when our motivation wanes, and it inevitably will, because motivation is not something we can guarantee will be there for life. So when our motivation wanes, so too does our success. And really, if that's the case, we need a recipe for success when we're not motivated. That is the critical issue. Or else your whole life will tend to sine wave along with periods of success matching periods of motivation, but that will be punctuated by long periods of failure as you are not motivated. So the whole idea is to have a plan to succeed when you are not motivated, and that comes with good planning and problem solving and having the contingency plans in place. Again, to give you an example there, you might find if you're going out for a brisk morning walk Monday through Friday before work, you wake up one morning and there's a torrential downpour, a 30-knot gale and some hailstones. Well, you're not that motivated, so you tend to hit the snooze button and go back to sleep. But good planning would have ensured that you had a backup indoor activity program. Or you look at all the other things, you're travelling or on holidays, your squash partner has twisted their ankle, or the local pool's closed for cleaning or whatever. These are all the sorts of things that can stop you achieving your goals, but many of them are quite predictable and can be allowed for in the planning process.
One area that many people in business relate to is indeed stress. What can we do to make life less stressful?
The strategy is pretty much managing our perceptions, and a lot of people have irrational perceptions of how stressful life events are. And your day-to-day garden variety stresses, for instance, I use an example in a lot of the corporate workshops I do. You say to someone, okay, you're driving home from work Friday night and someone runs into the back of your car on Sydney Harbour Bridge during peak hour. Well, it's shock, horror, and on the catastrophe scale that we use, they might rate that an 8, a 9 or a 10 out of 10. And I say that's irrational because imagine if you had a life-threatening illness to a loved one, a partner or a child or something. Really, they're the 10-pointers, and by comparison, a dent in the back of your car hardly rates. And I think we need to rationalise our perceptions and respond to life's events in a more justifiable and appropriate manner. And I go through in the book a number of ways we can do that. But that's managing perceptions. Of course, on the other side, you've developing the coping skills, the ability to relax, to turn off, to develop all that kit bag of tricks that help us to cope with stressful situations and demands. And a lot of it, funnily enough, does make sense, and we call it common sense, but for most people that doesn't mean common practice. And the book really is all about bridging that gap, often between the things we know we should do and the things that we actually do in real life.
You also talk about careers in your book, a very important component of life for many people, yet many of us, you suggest, aren't masters of that either. You suggest we tend to play it safe, which isn't good either for us or for business.
Yeah, look, playing it safe, there are certain times and places to play it safe. And look, I'm not advocating a lot of extensive risk-taking behaviour, but careers is one of those things, if you combine that with that knowledge and learning area, I think having a good vision of what we want to achieve in our career and undertaking the appropriate learning to achieve those sort of goals. We get within one organisation, we develop some skills, we undertake some extra learning, and often the doors are closed to us moving up because you're often within one organisation labelled as being at a certain level on a certain income, and often we need to step out to step up, and I think we need to look at those opportunities. And a lot of successful people fast-track themselves by being a bit more mobile, and I suppose with that goes giving up a bit of the security that goes with longer-term employment.
Now, you have a 5-point plan for a healthy, balanced lifestyle. What is it, and why is it different from others?
I used to call it the 4 pillars of good health: eat well, keep fit, manage stress, don't smoke. That's the basic physical and psychological health sort of thing, and that makes a lot of sense. The 5th one I've added in based on a lot of recent research is adequate sleep. And whereas 10 or 20 years ago we thought that if you didn't get enough sleep you ended up irritable, tired and grumpy, now we know that lack of sleep is associated with a whole lot of other much more sinister things. And just to run through a quick checklist, things like lack of sleep suppresses immune function, so you're predisposed to all sorts of illnesses, everything from garden variety colds and flus all the way through to cancer and heart disease. Sleep also increases insulin sensitivity, so lack of sleep can actually diminish insulin sensitivity by up to 40%, and that means that lack of sleep is a major risk factor for diabetes, something that was unknown some years back. And During the sleep cycle, we have these periodic secretions of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland in the brain, and in adults, growth hormone is essentially an anti-aging hormone, so inadequate sleep can compromise the levels of that very important hormone. So not only do we look old and feel old when we are tired and lacking sleep, but at the cellular level we are growing old. So there's a whole lot of good reasons from a health point of view to get good quality sleep, but also purely in terms of energy levels and productivity. You know, it's a wonderful feeling bouncing out of bed every morning ready to take on the challenges that the day throws up, and that is the sort of thing that happens with good quality sleep and of course the other good health management issues to go around it. And I think if we can do that, that also translates into better quality of life, because if we are more productive, we develop better self-esteem and all those sorts of issues. They're all wrapped in together.
Dr. John Lang, Re-Life. And that closes this January to March 2004 edition of Better Business CD. If you like receiving information in this audio format, you may like to subscribe, if you don't already, to our regular Business Essentials series. As well as information and ideas to help you run your business, the monthly program also contains regular economic and tax updates from Professor Neville Norman of Melbourne University and Peter Riley from Chartered Accountants Pitcher Partners. For details, visit our website at www.be.com.au. You may also like to visit the Better Business Magazine website at www.bbmagazine.com.au. If you're a subscriber to BB Magazine, you can access the magazine and CD content directly via the web. You'll also find some helpful links, business tools and other information there. If you'd like to contact us by phone, our number is 1800 039 098. 1800 039 098. I look forward to making contact with you again soon. I'm Michael Schildberger. Better Business CD is produced by Business Essentials Proprietary Limited in conjunction with magazine publishers Switzer Communications Proprietary Limited.